In a time when every man did what was right in his own eyes, when judges fell silent, priests became corrupt, and the people drifted from the covenant, there arose someone who wielded no scepter, raised no army, but upheld what no one else saw, justice. While some fled to foreign lands in search of bread, he remained. While the promises seemed extinguished, he bent over the dry ground, believing something could still bloom. His name, Boaz. You may only know him as Ruth's husband. But there's something few notice. Without Boaz, there would be no Obed. Without Obed, no Jesse. Without Jesse, no David. And without him, the messianic root would never have blossomed. But who was this man who was neither prophet nor king nor warrior, and yet upheld an entire lineage? Why does his story echo through the centuries in silence, without grand visible deeds, yet with eternal reverberations? And how did a simple act of redemption become the foundation of the eternal throne? What led Boaz to see hope in a foreign woman? Why does his name appear on Solomon's temple pillar? And most astonishing, why, without seeking glory, did he become part of the greatest mystery of the Christian faith? Before we dive into this silent yet grand story, click subscribe and turn on notifications, so none of these forgotten truths slip by unnoticed. Now then, prepare to discover the hidden truth behind Boaz's remarkable story. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Judges 21:25. The sun scorched the land of Bethlehem like a sentence. The hills that once fed flocks now looked like open wounds, parched by neglect and the absence of rain. Hunger was not just a reality, it was a character present in every home, in every gaze, in every breath, held behind worn wooden doors. The silence of the land mirrored that of the heavens. In the center of the city, sitting under the twisted shade of an almost barren olive tree, was Boaz. His light tunic carried the dust of the field in its creases, and his beard, once well kept, began to show signs of the daily struggle. His eyes, sunken under thick eyebrows, searched for something on the horizon that could no longer be seen. He was no king, no prophet, no priest, but he was a judge. And in that generation, that meant more than pronouncing sentences. It meant resisting with your life where there was no order. It meant upholding what little remained of hope. Since the days of Othniel, stability had vanished like dew at noon. The tribes were scattered in purpose. Each followed his own heart, even if it led them to the abyss. The altars were forgotten. The elders remained silent in the face of corruption. The Levites lived without a fixed dwelling. And the people, the surviving people, crawled among the ruins of what was once a promised land. Bethlehem, the house of bread, now fed not even the birds. Boaz, though he inherited no title, was recognized among men as upright. He was not a leader by imposition, but by lack of alternative. He kept the scales just even when the weight of survival pushed everyone toward deceit. When men came selling wheat mixed with chaff, he refused. When widows asked for more than their measure, he granted it. And when night fell, he prayed standing, among withered stalks and empty jars. In the town square, men gathered not for trade, but to cry out. The seeds wouldn't sprout, mothers couldn't feed their children. The priests bent over, feared the heavens had shut their windows for good. Boaz, his gaze fixed on the cracked ground, listened. Each plea was a stone in his stomach. Each cry, a nail on his shoulders. If only we had leaders like in the days of Moses, murmured an elder. Or at least rain, added another, wiping sweat that didn't come from heat. Boaz stood up slowly. There were no promises on his lips, but a steadiness that asked for no applause. He walked among the men as one who carried the weight of keeping hope alive, even if he no longer fully felt it. His eyes met those of the young, those who considered fleeing to Moab like Elimelech. He didn't judge them. Moab had bread. Bethlehem had only memories, but he didn't follow them either, because Boaz was the kind who, even with empty hands, chose to stay. That night, he retired to his small barn. It was more stone shelter than home. A few ears of grain lay under cloths. Almost no wine. The lamp, lit with oil from past days, flickered under the wind, sneaking through cracks in the walls. Even so, he opened a scroll, already frayed at the edges by time, and recited the precepts of the Torah. His voice was deep, rhythmic. To him, justice was not an emotion, it was a covenant. It was solid ground when all around sank. He slept late, and in dreams he saw green fields, not because of harvest, but because of restored justice. He saw children running without fear, men laughing without shame, and a woman with firm eyes, a foreigner kneeling to glean. But Boaz didn't yet understand the image. He simply kept it in his heart, like one who guards a seed in winter, not knowing it's time to sprout. The next day began with more heat, more hunger, more doubt. Shepherds returned with thin flocks. Women beat clothes on bare stones. Children looked at the hands of adults, hoping for crumbs. But Boaz, as on other days, rose, not to fix everything, but to endure. Because in a generation without kings, silent faithfulness was the only crown left. And Boaz, though throneless, reigned over himself. Elimelech's decisions spread like dust over the square of Bethlehem, a respected man, heir of lands, patriarch of a known name. And yet, at the first sign of a failed harvest, he prepared the donkeys, gathered what was left of the wheat, took his wife and sons, and left for Moab. He abandoned the house of bread to seek sustenance among Israel's ancestral enemies. For many, it was a sensible choice. For Boaz, it was a wound. He said nothing, did not judge, just watched. From the hillside, he saw the small procession disappear on the horizon, covered by clouds of sand. His eyes remained fixed for minutes, after the last figure vanished. Beside him, the field steward remained silent, waiting for orders. Boaz gave none. The field was arid. The land cracked, the wells deeper each day. Even so, he chose to stay. He cared for the land with calloused hands and watchful eyes, not out of pride, but conviction. He knew the promises made to Israel were not tied to abundance, but to faithfulness. Staying was harder than leaving, and lonelier than hiding. But Boaz believed that even in the wilderness, the covenant could still bloom. Every day, before the sun reached its peak, he rose, walked through the fields, touching the soil with his fingers, called the servants by name, counted the animals, divided the bread according to need. He avoided speeches, preferred gestures. To those who saw him from afar, he seemed just another landowner trying to keep control of a collapsing estate. But inside, Boaz was fighting. Not against the people, nor the Moabites, but against the erosion of faith. The city of Bethlehem was hollowing from within, even before losing its people. The elders gave disheartened advice. The young wanted to abandon the law. Some sold their possessions at unfair prices or hid them under their cloaks. And more voices echoed, "You is silent, we must find other ways." Boaz refused, not because he was blind to pain, but because he remembered. He remembered the stories of old, how Abraham stayed in Canaan even during famine, how Isaac didn't go down to Egypt, how Joseph sustained Egypt with grain and faith. He clung, to those stories like one holding a thread over an abyss, not because they guaranteed immediate deliverance, but because they showed that the right path isn't always the easiest. At night, the city plunged into darkness. No oil, no songs, no celebrations. The homes smelled of anguish and heavy silences. But in Boaz's storehouse, a lamp still burned. He read the scrolls alone, as if every word of the Torah were a drop of water over the dry land of his heart. At times, he spoke softly to the Eternal. He didn't demand signs. He simply asked for strength to remain standing. One morning, a servant brought news that Mahlon, Elimelech's son, had fallen ill. Boaz felt the weight but said nothing. He simply did what he knew, increased the poor's portion that day, ordered more barley to be ground, and distributed bread in silence without his name being mentioned. The heritage of his house was not just the land, it was the name, and Boaz knew that upholding the name meant more than preserving a lineage. It was sustaining the reputation of the covenant. While others abandoned the altar, he rebuilt it stone by stone, with actions, with justice, with patience. Years passed, seasons came and went without abundant harvest, but Boaz kept going. He walked with slow steps, calloused feet, simple tunic, and even when the land gave no reply, his heart did not fall silent. Deep down, he knew someone would come, not to restore abundance, but to answer faithfulness with purpose. He just didn't imagine that answer would come from Moab, or that it would arrive on the bare feet of a foreign widow, in silence asking for crumbs. But that was still in the future. If you've made it this far, it's because this story spoke to you in some way. So take a moment, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it with someone. It's simple, it costs nothing, and you become part of a family that grows with every new story. Let's keep going. The next chapter is already waiting for you. Ruth 1:1-5. The wind blew dry over Bethlehem, but what arrived that morning wasn't dust, it was rumor. First a whisper among the shepherds, then among the women drawing water from the wells. Finally, before the elders, without anyone needing to confirm it, Elimelech was dead. Boaz knew before anyone said it. The look in the messenger's eyes was enough. The young man who had once left with his master now returned alone, thinner, his skin marked by the Moabite sun, and his eyes bearing what his mouth feared to speak. Boaz did not stand. He remained seated beneath the shade of the fig tree in the town square, as he always did. But something in his face shifted, not in anger, nor in lament, but in a deeper silence. He listened to the account without interruption. Elimelech dead, then Mahlon, then Chilion. 3 graves dug in foreign land, a name erased, a legacy undone. The men around reacted with shock. Some cursed the decision to leave, others mourned for Naomi, now a widow without sons. Boaz simply closed his eyes. Within him, a memory lit up. Elimelech's last steps leaving Bethlehem, the hesitant look of the woman following him, the wavering sons. And now, all of it was dust. But it was upon hearing one name that Boaz opened his eyes more firmly. Ruth. The messenger barely knew how to describe her. She was young, Moabite Mahlon's widow, and according to Naomi, had refused to return to her homeland. She had decided to follow her mother-in-law to Bethlehem, even without knowing the people, the language, or the faith. She had said something about a new God and about an uncommon loyalty. Boaz said nothing aloud, but the name remained. Ruth, a foreigner who chose to come, while so many Israelites chose to leave, a woman without husband, inheritance, or security, and yet willing to walk toward a city in ruins. Why? The following days were marked by unrest, not in Boaz, but in everything around him. Naomi had not yet arrived, but rumors spread like embers in dry straw. There would be scandal, comments, disdain. Who would welcome a Moabite among the sons of Judah? Who would take in a poor, widowed foreigner when even the locals had no bread? Boaz returned to his fields. The land still did not yield abundantly, but something had changed in his eyes. He walked with his gaze fixed on the road where Elimelech's caravan had departed years earlier, as if expecting at any moment to see two figures crossing the gates, one bent with time, the other unknown. One night, in his simple home, he lit the lamp earlier than usual. He sat, as always, before the Torah scroll, but he didn't read. He just watched the fire dance. He thought of the judges of old, of days when foreigners were plague and threat. But he also remembered Tamar, Rahab, so many other women who, though outside the lineage, were grafted into the story through faithfulness, not blood. A voice seemed to echo in the back of his memory. Your people will be my people, your God, my God. He didn't yet know those words would be spoken, but something within him already heard them, not as prophecy, but as echo. The next morning, word came that Naomi had been seen approaching the city. She was close. Boaz did not run to see her. He returned to the fields. He instructed the servants to prepare the edges so the poor could glean. The land was still dry, but something in him, imperceptible still, had begun to bloom. And though nothing in his face revealed it, the seed of an encounter had already been sown. Not by desire, nor by destiny, but by something he would later understand as purpose. The gate of Bethlehem creaked as it was pushed open. Dust rose under the tired feet of two women. The men gathered in the square turned their faces, surprised. Some women exchanged confused glances, others stepped back in silence, and Naomi stopped. Not because she didn't know where to go, but because time suddenly returned upon her with all its weight. It had been 14 years away, 14 years burying husband and sons, living among a strange people, sustained by the labor of a daughter-in-law who owed her nothing. And now there she stood, before the same stones, the same ground, the same wooden doors she once crossed with hope. Boaz heard the commotion and lifted his eyes from the field. He was far, but not too far. He recognized Naomi before anyone called her name. Her appearance had changed, thinner, more stooped, paler, but her eyes still carried the dignity that had marked her since youth. Yet it wasn't on her that his gaze lingered. The woman beside her was different. Tall, wrapped in a simple cloak, dark hair partly covered, a serious face. She didn't look around. Her eyes were fixed on the ground, but there was firmness in her steps. It wasn't timidity. It was reverence. It was pain, and at the same time, courage. Boaz didn't know her name, but he knew who she was. Voices began to rise. Some whispered about the audacity of bringing a Moabite. Others recalled Elimelech's family tragedies and used their return as proof of judgment. But Ruth did not respond, nor did Naomi. They just walked. Later, Boaz crossed paths with them in the square. He didn't speak. He just watched. It was customary for respectable men not to address newly arrived widows without invitation. But something in Ruth's gaze held his attention. There was no striking beauty, no ornaments, but there was faith, bare, visible, unguarded. Faith from someone who may not know every letter of the Torah, but lives its commandments in silence. Naomi was housed in one of the abandoned homes near the edge of town. Some distant relatives sent bread, others pretended not to see her. But Boaz quietly sent some barley. No note, no greeting, just bread. Warm, fresh, placed on a clean cloth, not out of charity, but out of honor. That night, lying in his bed, Boaz thought. Ruth was Moabite. The blood of Balak flowed through her lineage. Her story was the opposite of everything Israel had learned to avoid, and yet she had chosen misery beside an elderly woman instead of comfort in her own land. Chosen the people of Israel, even when ignored by them. Chosen the God of Israel, even without visible promises. Naomi, some said, didn't want to leave the house, but Ruth was already seen drawing water, gathering grains, quietly asking where the poor might glean. She didn't hide, didn't complain, didn't demand. She simply served. And Boaz, who had seen men pretend justice while exploiting the poor, now saw there in the dust at the feet of a foreigner living justice. The next morning, he called one of his men and said softly, "When she comes to glean, let some extra stalks fall to the ground, but make it look like an accident." The servant didn't question. He was used to the master's discreet gestures. And so, without a word exchanged, without a promise made, Boaz began to build, not a plan, not an approach, but a memory. That of a man who saw, and of a woman who, even from exile, carried the sacred on her shoulders. Ruth 2, 1-16. The field was already bustling when Boaz arrived. The servants moved among the rows of barley, skillfully cutting what the land was finally beginning to return. It wasn't an abundant harvest, but it was enough to give thanks. In silence, the scent of cut straw mingled with the sweat of the workers and the rhythmic sound of sickles. As usual, Boaz greeted the reapers. "The Lord be with you." "The Lord bless you," they replied in unison. He walked among them attentively, not like a master inspecting, but like someone who knows the land by name. He noticed details that went unseen by others: the thickness of the straw, the color of the leaves, the weight of the sheaves. But that day, his gaze was drawn to something unusual: a woman. She gleaned at the edges, where the poor had the right. She adjusted her skirt to form an improvised basket and gathered fallen stalks carefully and quickly. She didn't rush, but neither did she rest. The servants left her alone, but it was clear she didn't belong to their group, and Boaz knew who she was. "Who is that young woman?" he asked the foreman. "It's the Moabite who came back." "With Naomi, sir," the man replied. "She asked permission to glean among the sheaves. She's been here since early morning, only stopped briefly." Boaz was silent for a few seconds. Then he approached her. Ruth was bent over, her fingers covered in dust. When she noticed the shadow approaching, she cautiously lifted her eyes. There was no fear on her face, only steadiness. "Listen, my daughter," Boaz said, firm and calm. "Do not go glean in another field, and do not leave this one. Stay close to the young women, follow behind the reapers. I've ordered that no one harass you. When you're thirsty, drink from the water the men draw." Ruth bowed and prostrated herself with her face to the ground. "Why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, a foreigner?" Boaz looked at her intently. There was no vanity in her question, no manipulation. It was the genuine surprise of someone who never expected to be seen. "I've been told in detail all you've done for your mother-in-law after the death of your husband," he said. "How you left father, mother, and the land of your birth, and came to a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you, and may your reward be full, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Ruth stood there for a moment, speechless. That man, a judge, a landowner, spoke to her as if she were worthy of blessing, as if her choice, until then invisible to the city, was worthy of remembrance. At noon, Boaz invited her to eat with the workers. They sat together, and she was served bread, wine, and roasted grain. She ate until she was satisfied, and still saved some for Naomi. But what came next revealed Boaz's quiet nature. He discreetly called his men and instructed, "Let stalks fall on purpose for her." Do not rebuke her. Let her glean freely. This was how Boaz practiced justice, not with speeches but with gestures, not with laws but with mercy. He didn't turn fields into courts, but into spaces of dignity. By day's end, Ruth had gathered, more than expected, an ephah of barley, nearly 30 kilos. She carried it on her shoulders in silence back to Naomi's house. The weight was heavy, but what she bore was more than food. It was proof that there were still men who saw, and Boaz from afar watched. He knew it wasn't just justice. Something had been born there, not declared love, nor intention, but a compassion that springs when two paths cross under the Eternal's gaze. It was the second day of harvest. The field still smelled of freshly cut straw, and the air held the heat of a season slow to end. Ruth arrived early, as she had the day before, her bare feet leaving marks on the ground. She asked no permission, waited for no invitation. She simply returned, as one who understands that sustenance is often found in repeated effort. Boaz saw her before the reapers began. He stood, arms crossed over his wooden staff, observing the movement, but his eyes stayed fixed on her. There was something in the way Ruth gleaned that stirred him, a mix of old sorrow and new reverence. She was a woman without home, without name among the sons of Israel, yet with a dignity that couldn't be taught. He was not a man of easy words. His authority came from a silence others respected. But that day, Boaz broke the distance. He called her, not with orders, with gentleness. "Come closer," he said. "Eat some bread and dip your piece in the vinegar." Ruth hesitated. Sitting with the reapers was bold, but there was truth in his voice, and safety. She sat in the shade, distant yet present. Boaz himself offered her roasted grain. She ate, not ravenously like someone starving, but with restrained gratitude. She saved some for Naomi, discreetly hiding it under her cloak. The servants watched, but none dared comment. It was known that when Boaz made a decision, it wasn't debated, and there before all, he had done more than feed a Moabite. He had included her. After the meal, Boaz walked among the harvest rows and murmured instructions only the attentive could hear. "Let more stalks fall for her. Do not shame her. Do not touch her. Wherever she walks, give her space." Ruth kept gleaning until evening. She didn't know the plentiful bundles were the work of the judge's generous hand. She carried it all in her arms, and as she walked back to the city, her mind clung to the words spoken hours before. "The Lord repay you for what you have done, and may your reward be full from the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." She didn't know that phrase, which seemed merely a blessing, would be recorded, that it would echo through the centuries, that it would be repeated by kings, rabbis, and prophets. But in that moment, she knew. She was under wings. Invisible, yes, but real. Boaz walked slowly home. He was not young. His body felt the days, the weight, the time. But his spirit carried something new, not desire. He hadn't allowed himself that yet, but a stirring that didn't come from the flesh. It was as if something was being woven without his permission, as if what had started, injustice, was being shaped by something older, deeper, holier. That night, he sat alone under the roof of ancient beams. The silence was complete, but inside there were too many words. He thought of Tamar, of Rahab, of all the women God had not rejected, even when Israel did. He thought of his own blood, his old age, his name without heirs, and without realizing, his lips whispered, "May she remain under those wings, even if not with me." But in heaven, where the dust of prayers rises, the seed had already been sown. Ruth 3:1-9. The barley had already been threshed, stacked under the night that blanketed the field like a thick cloak. The workers had eaten and lain down right there around the threshing floor, guarding the harvest from thieves and animals. The city slept, but in a humble house on the outskirts of Bethlehem, Naomi's eyes remained open. "My daughter, should I not seek rest for you?" she murmured, barely audible. Ruth, sitting in the shadow of the lamp, looked up. Since their arrival, Naomi had been watching Boaz's silent care, the stalks deliberately left behind, the food sent without fanfare, the gaze that never lingered, but also never strayed. "He is our relative," Naomi whispered. "One of our redeemers," Ruth said nothing. Her soul still trembled under the weight of traditions she did not fully understand. But Naomi knew, and she continued, "Wash yourself, anoint yourself, put on your best clothes and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to him until he has eaten and drunk. When he lies down, notice the place. Go, uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do." Night was falling when Ruth descended the hill. The field slept. The sky, covered in clouds, let no light through. Every step she took was careful. Every breath held. And when she finally saw Boaz lying there, covered up to his chest, her heart pounded as if it wanted to be heard. She approached with reverence, knelt, gently uncovered his feet, and there she lay, at his feet, not as a servant, but as one seeking refuge. Hours later, Boaz awoke. The night wind cut through the silence. Something was different. He moved and noticed the shadow at his feet. Startled, he asked, "Who are you?" His voice was firm but low. The answer came as a broken yet steady whisper. "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread the corner of your garment over your servant, for you are a redeemer." There was a long silence, not from hesitation, but because for a moment time ceased to move. Boaz understood. This was not seduction. It was covenant. It was not provocation. It was a plea for redemption. She did not ask for love. She asked for justice with mercy. Boaz slowly sat up, looked at her in the faint light of the hidden moon. He saw not a young woman, but a wounded inheritance seeking shelter. And he replied, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have shown more loyalty in this last act than in the first, for you have not gone after young men, whether rich or poor. Now do not fear, I will do for you all that you ask. For everyone in town knows you are a woman of virtue." Ruth remained silent. Her eyes were lowered, but her chest heaved. "It is true that I am your redeemer," Boaz continued, "but there is another closer than I. Tomorrow I will see what must be done. Stay here tonight. In the morning we will decide with justice." Then he extended his cloak. Ruth covered herself, and there she remained at his feet until dawn. Before the sun rose, Boaz got up and gently filled her veil with barley, a generous amount. It was not just food, it was a promise, a symbol that something had been sealed there, not with kisses, but with honor. She left before anyone could see her. And Boaz remained, standing, looking at the still gray sky. He knew that the next day would bring difficult decisions, but at the threshold of night, among stalks, veils, and silence, the story had changed. And he, who had only protected, now had to choose whether he would be the one to cover or to let go. Ruth 4. It was still dawn when Boaz rose. The sky barely outlined the olive trees, and the morning cold still stung his hands. But his eyes had been awake since the night before. There was no more time to lose. Ruth's act, silent and full of faith, now required a public response. Justice to be complete, had to walk to the city gate, and Boaz knew exactly what that meant. In Israel's tradition, legal decisions were established in plain sight. It was at the gate that contracts became covenants, where memory became record. And it was there, among stones, voices, and witnesses, that Boaz chose to resolve what Ruth had asked of him at the threshing floor: redemption. He dressed simply but firmly, linen tunic, cloak over his shoulders, staff in hand, not as one going to war, but as one bearing the weight of justice. He arrived at the gate in silence. The sound of animals being prepared, the first servants sweeping dust from the squares, the elders arriving in line. He greeted them with a look, and that was enough. Soon 10 men sat around him, the number required to validate a judgment. He knew every line of the law. And more, he knew his own heart. Soon, the other Redeemer arrived. A man of means, respected, a closer relative of Elimelech, Boaz called him. "Sit here, friend, we have a matter to discuss." The man sat down, curious. Boaz spoke clearly. "Naomi, who has returned from the fields of Moab, is selling the portion of land that belonged to our brother Elimelech. I thought to inform you, for you have the right to redeem it. If you wish to redeem it, do so. If not, I will." The man hesitated for a moment and replied, "I will redeem it." Boaz's heart did not falter. He expected that answer, but it wasn't over. "On the day you acquire the field from Naomi, you will also acquire Ruth, the Moabite, the widow of the deceased, to raise up the name of the dead upon his inheritance." The man was silent. Their eyes met. The tension was thick like clouds before rain. Then came the response, "I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Redeem it yourself in my place, for I cannot." Boaz nodded. It was what he needed to hear. The man took off his sandal, an old custom of confirmation, and gave it to Boaz. The elders witnessed it. The crowd drew near. The news spread. Boaz then stood before all and declared, "You are witnesses today that I have acquired from Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech, Kilion, and Mahlon, and I also take Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, as my wife, to raise up the name of the deceased upon his inheritance." The voices of the elders responded with blessings. They compared Ruth to Rachel and Leah. They invoked the name of Perez, son of Tamar and Judah, and amid the rejoicing Boaz stood firm. There was no visible joy on his face. What he felt was not triumph, but weight. Because redemption is not conquest, it is commitment. He was not gaining a woman. He was taking on a broken lineage, a forgotten name, a ruined inheritance. It was the echo of Tamar in Judah, the echo of justice in the dust. As he left the gate, Boaz looked at the city. Bethlehem was still the same, but something in his spirit knew that from that moment on, the world had changed. Because that morning, between law and mercy, he chose both. Ruth 4:1-10. The crowd was already gathering at the gate when the final act began. There were no trumpets, no official scrolls. But for those who knew the law, that moment carried the weight of an eternal verdict. Boaz stood before the elders, with the same posture he had always had, a firm stance, steady gaze, open hands. In front of him, the other Redeemer, the closest relative of Elimelech, hesitated with the sandal in his hand. A simple gesture, yet one that bore the weight of transferred responsibility. In Israel, the exchange of a sandal was more than a symbol. It was a living signature, a public act, a silent covenant. The man extended the sandal, and Boaz received it without hesitation. The crowd around murmured. Some smiled, others simply watched. That ancient gesture sealed something far greater than land or name. It sealed redemption. Boaz raised his voice strong and clear. "You are witnesses today that I have acquired from Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech, Kilion, and Mahlon. And I also take Ruth, the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, as my wife, to raise up the name of the dead on his inheritance, so that his name will not be cut off from among his brothers, or from the gate of his town. You are witnesses today. Silence. Then a chorus of voices. We are witnesses. The elders, moved, declared blessings that seemed to echo from ancestral times. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you have standing in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem. May your house be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. Boaz gave no reply. He received the blessing like one carrying water on weary shoulders. He knew what lay ahead. The people saw honor, celebration, but he saw responsibility. To redeem was not a conquest, it was a calling. As he left the gate, he walked slowly back to his fields. The voices faded behind. The echoes of the exchanged sandal still rang in his mind. He remembered Tamar, the forgotten woman who had to disguise herself to be heard. He remembered Judah, who recognized his fault too late. Now he himself became a link in that broken and restored lineage. He was not merely taking a woman, he was taking on a past, a people, a purpose. Ruth did not yet know. She was at home with Naomi, preparing bread and keeping silence. When Boaz crossed the threshold, there was no celebration, only glances and a gesture. He placed the sandal before her, the symbol that she would not be left barefoot, that the shame of widowhood and poverty would not define her. She looked at the object and then at him, and she understood. No romantic promises, no theatrical vows, just the resolve of a man who, before the law, had chosen covenant. That night, Bethlehem slept as on any other, but in heaven the name of Boaz was added to the lineage of the promise, and an exchanged sandal became a bridge between the dust of the earth and the throne of a future king. The name of Boaz was repeated at the gates of the city, but that day he was no longer just a judge or lord of the fields or the righteous man who had supported widows and preserved his inheritance. He was now a husband, and with that he carried the weight of two stories, his own and that of a man who had died childless. The voices of the crowd still echoed through the stone corridors. At you, the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah. Powerful words spoken with faith and tradition. But for Boaz, they were more than blessings, they were a mission. Rachel, barren. Leah, unloved. And yet, from them came the tribes. Now, from a Moabite, something unexpected would arise. The improbable. Ruth entered her new home in silence. There was no procession, no music. Only the sound of the fire being kindled, the bread being kneaded, the water being poured into clean jars. Her steps were light, but her presence was steady. Boaz welcomed her without ceremony. No ritual beyond the covenant already sealed at the gate before God and men. She used to dry soil and sacrifice, asked for neither gold nor silk, only space and dignity. He gave her both, and for that she remained. The people viewed the union with reverence. Many murmured that they had never imagined such a thing, a man of Judah taking a Moabite woman as his wife. But those who knew the story, those who remembered Tamar, Rahab, knew that the promise always walked along the margins. Boaz continued his work in the fields. He cared for the harvests, the workers, the widows who now looked to him as a model. But something had changed in his demeanor. He was lighter, his eyes once focused only on justice, now knew tenderness. There was a peace in his home that he had not felt since his youth. It was not a sudden passion, it was a covenant built from the ground up. The days passed. The women of the town, ever watchful, began to gather around Ruth. They observed her closely, some with suspicion, others with admiration. But when they saw how she honored Naomi, how she followed the customs, how she allowed herself to be shaped by the faith of the people she had chosen, the murmuring turned to praise. And then came the news. Ruth had conceived. The womb once, marked by widowhood, now carried promise, not only for her, but for an entire lineage. The elders gathered again, and the blessing was once more pronounced, now with eyes brimming with reverence. May your house be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. Boaz listened. Ruth, in silence, held Naomi's hands as she wept. The widow of Elimelech, who had returned with empty arms, would now be called blessed among women, for an heir had come, and she, as a mother, was born again. Josephus would write, centuries later, that this union was remembered in Bethlehem as a silent miracle, not for grand feats, but because it restored the name, because it rebuilt a broken lineage, because it reminded Israel that God sometimes plants kings in foreign soil and nurtures hope in the womb of the forgotten. Boaz did not seek glory. Ruth did not seek redemption. But together, without fanfare, they established a name that would not disappear in genealogies, a name that, though covered in dust and pain, would endure. If this content is touching your heart, become part of what we're building here. Just subscribe, like, and share. You lose nothing by doing so, and you help this truth go further. The next scene begins now. Ruth 4:13-17. Time passed in silence, as days often do where there is peace. The fields bore fruit once more, the workers smiled more often, and Boaz, though no longer young, walked with lighter steps. The house that for years had known only routines and responsibilities now filled with soft voices, those of Ruth, Naomi, and finally that of a child yet to be born. Ruth's womb grew like fertile soil in due season. The women of the town murmured among themselves that her pregnancy was a sign, not of luck, but of blessing. They said God had not forgotten Bethlehem, and perhaps Elimelech's name had not been erased after all. But few understood the magnitude of what was being formed. Boaz was discreet in his joy. He did not speak of what he felt. He continued working, walking through the fields, praying at dusk. But those who knew him could tell something within him rested with gratitude. He had not only redeemed a name, he had sown life where there had only been mourning. And even without understanding what would come next, he knew he had fulfilled his duty. The day of the birth arrived under a clear sky. The midwives gathered in the house. Naomi remained by Ruth's side, holding her hand tightly. It was she who now trembled, not the Moabite. Ruth faced the pain of childbirth with the same resolve with which she had faced hunger, exile, and prejudice. And when the boy's cry filled the air, it was Naomi who cried first. The boy was placed in the arms of the elder. She held him as one holds a son returned from the grave. The women around her said, "A son has been born to Naomi." She did not protest. That boy was hers too, not by blood, but by faithfulness. Boaz arrived shortly after. He entered quietly, as always. He looked at Ruth, exhausted and serene. Then at Naomi, eyes full, and finally his eyes rested on the child. The baby moved his fingers, furrowed his brow. Boaz took him in his arms with care. His grey beard brushed the child's face, and for a moment he closed his eyes. Everything he had lived, the hard decisions, the barren fields, the redeemed name, the quiet honor, all converged into that moment. The child was small, but what he carried was immense. "His name will be Obed," said one of the women. "Servant," another added, "because he was born from a heart that served without expecting anything in return." No one there knew that this boy would be the father of Jesse and grandfather of David. No one knew that from his blood would come an eternal throne. But Boaz felt something he could not explain, like an ancient breeze, like the scent of a field before the rain. In the following days, he returned to his routine, but his strength was no longer the same. His body grew heavier, his vision darkened at times, his steps faltered here and there. Ruth noticed but said nothing. She knew he had reached the end of his mission. Boaz, in his last winter, still wandered through the fields. He looked at the ears of grain and smiled with his eyes, not because of what he owned, but because of what he was leaving behind. Not land, not gold, but a name and a boy. The last time he was seen, Boaz was sitting in the shade of a fig tree with Obed. In his arms, the boy was asleep. And the man, weary, stared at the sky like one who knows his story had reached its final period, not with a cry, but with a breath. And there, under the gentle light of dusk, the promise was fulfilled. The Redeemer rested, but the name remained. In Boaz's house, the song of life still echoed. Obed slept in Ruth's arms, and Naomi walked through the rooms with light steps, as one who was not just dwelling in a house again, but returning to her own heart. The women of the people still came to visit with gifts, praises, and smiles. The blessing of the elders had come to pass. At last, everything seemed to be at rest, but not Boaz. Since the day he held the boy in his arms, something within him had quieted. Not from sadness, but from exhaustion. The body that had borne so much without complaint now gave way in silence. Mornings became slower. His appetite faded. Words became rare, but his eyes shone like never before. Ruth noticed first how he sat for longer, how he gazed at the fields without moving, how he passed his fingers through the folds of his cloak, repeating the gesture of someone who does not want to forget the texture of the world. But she said nothing. She knew. Some silences are sacred, and that eternity sometimes begins this way, from within. Boaz fell ill quietly. No raging fever, no cries of pain, just a gradual fading. The city slowly noticed his absence from the fields, from the city gate, among the workers. And then they understood. The righteous was departing. Naomi sat at his bedside. She held his hand with the strength of one who had known death, but now faced it with honor. Ruth, with Obed in her lap, just watched. The boy, still without words, touched his father's arm with curiosity and boundless love. Boaz smiled, his last smile before his voice left him. Tradition would record that he died that very night, not from illness, but from a mission completed. Some would say the Eternal called him at his peak, as he had called Enoch, before corruption could touch him. Others, that his soul, having recognized the promise embodied in the boy, saw no more reason to stay. But Ruth did not theorize. She simply wept. The city fell silent. The people descended from the hill in procession. The servants closed the gates. The elders tore their robes. In Bethlehem there was no loud lament, there was reverence. Boaz did not die as any man. He died as one who had lived faithfully to the end. And even without a crown, even without a throne, he left a name that would reign for generations. Ruth washed his body with her own hands, as a wife, as a daughter, as one who honors the dust that nourished the promise. Then she gave the boy to Naomi and went out. She needed to breathe. She needed to be alone. From the top of a rock, she looked at the field. The same field where she had gleaned fallen stalks, where she had heard words of grace, where she had been seen for the first time. The same place now seemed infinite, because the man who had welcomed her among the poor now rested among the righteous. That evening no music was played, no lavish ceremony was held. Only the earth opened, and the name of Boaz, no longer spoken with human voice, began to echo in the heavens. There, between the dust and the song of silence, the Redeemer was buried, and a story that once seemed simple became a seed of eternity. Boaz's body was prepared before the sun rose. Ruth remained by his side with no visible tears. Her grief was of another kind, deep, dense, silent. Naomi, already familiar with death, withdrew into a quiet mourning. But there was something in that loss that transcended ordinary absences. It was not just the end of a man, it was the end of a foundation. The elders gathered early. There was no formal summons. They simply came, one by one, in somber garments, with downcast faces, and eyes that recognized what they were about to bury, the voice of justice of their generation. The city of Bethlehem awoke in silence. Even the children noticed. The fields were without paths. The women put away their jars, and the reapers, for one day, did not cut a thing. Boaz was buried in the land he had so faithfully cultivated. There was no ornate tomb, just simple stones reverently stacked, and around them the people, standing, some in silence, others murmuring blessings. An old servant knelt at the ground and kissed the earth. A widow brought flowers. A young man who had once gleaned from the edges at Boaz's order brought a bundle of barley, his best offering. The service was brief. No exalted words, only truth. One elder spoke. Boaz did not seek glory, but he gave us peace. He did not cry out for justice, but he lived it. Today we return to the earth one who no longer belongs to us, because heaven has claimed him. Ruth remained in the shade of a nearby fig tree, holding Obed in her arms. The boy did not yet understand the weight of the day, but his eyes, brown like his father's, seemed to absorb everything. It was his first encounter with mourning, and also his first inheritance. The women came close. They touched Ruth's shoulder. They said little, and that was comfort. Because there are pains words cannot reach, and griefs only silence can understand. Naomi at the end knelt. With trembling hands, she touched the last stone of the tomb. Her lips moved, but only God heard what she said. The crowd slowly dispersed, but something lingered in the air. Not just sadness, it was honor. A sense that something eternal had happened. Without trumpets, without an altar. That afternoon, Ruth returned home with slow steps. She prepared bread, heated water. Life had to go on. But everything had changed. The man who had called her daughter, who saw beyond her origins, who covered her with words and gestures, now rested in the dust. Days later, when neighbors came to visit, they no longer spoke only of the burial. They spoke of the inheritance, not of the land, but of the name. Boaz, the Redeemer. Boaz, the righteous. Boaz, who protected without possessing, who gave without demanding, who loved with honor. The Midrash, centuries later, would say that his soul went straight to Gan Eden, not for miracles, but for faithfulness, because Boaz showed that justice does not need applause, only truth. And that redemption is sometimes written with calloused hands and a steadfast heart. Obed began to crawl days later, and the people said, Ruth's son walks through Boaz's fields, as if the promise's cycle had not been broken by death, but strengthened through it. And so, between dust and longing, the name remained. Ruth 4:21-22. Boaz's name was not lost in the genealogies. It was passed down, not as a distant echo, but as a milestone. Generations later, when the scribes compiled the names of those who carried the bloodline that would lead to David. There he was, Boaz, father of Obed, grandfather of Jesse. And even though his words ceased with death, his deeds still spoke in the records of the elders. Among the judges of Israel, Boaz was not the most warrior-like. He did not lead armies, did not wield a sword, did not liberate besieged cities. But he liberated a name, redeemed a woman, protected the law, and for that, his judgment endures. The people who saw him walk the fields began to teach their children about him. The rabbis cited his life as an example of justice balanced by compassion. They said he was faithful to the Torah, but also sensitive to what the Torah did not say, and to what was written only between the lines, mercy. At the gate of Bethlehem, where decisions were recorded, men still sat on the same stones, and when a difficult case arose, when the law seemed insufficient to embrace the pain, someone would say, "Remember Boaz," because he was the one who, without breaking a single precept, knew how to welcome the stranger, the unlikely, the foreign. In study houses, his name arose in discussions about redeemers. The Talmud referred to him not as an ordinary man, but as the paradigm of one who understood the role of a goel, the redeemer, as an act of surrender, not conquest. He did not take Ruth out of desire, nor out of vanity. He took her out of justice. Ruth, now a mother, sat at her doorstep with Obed on her lap. The boy grew with watchful eyes and a calm spirit. He had inherited from Boaz not just his blood, but his way of seeing the world. And the people watched. They said the boy had something royal in him, even before a monarchy existed. Naomi told stories, not of tragedies, but of faithfulness. She spoke little of Moab and much of the barley fields, Boaz's words, the exchanged sandal, the elder's blessing. Every phrase she spoke about him was a testimony, and every time she said, "Our Redeemer," her voice did not tremble. In elders' gatherings, other names were recalled, Gideon, Deborah, Jephthah. But when it came to justice without the sword, to strength with gentleness, to faithfulness in times of scarcity, Boaz was mentioned, the judge who did not rule over tribes but restored a lineage. Boaz's legacy lay not only in the son he begot, but in the way he died, with clean hands, with a peaceful soul, with an honored name. He did not seek posterity, but posterity came, and his lineage was established not only in the land of Judah, but in the heavens of promise. And so at the end of each public reading of the genealogy, when it was said Boaz begot Obed, there was a brief silence, not out of formality, but out of reverence, because all knew that behind that name there was more than descent, there was redemption. 1 Kings 7:21. Time passed like the wind that bends trees but does not uproot their roots. Bethlehem remained alive, still small, still humble, but forever marked by the story that had been sealed there. Obed grew. Jesse was born, and in the generations that followed, Boaz's name was not forgotten. It was whispered among rabbis, memorized by scribes, cited by elders, not just as an ancestor, but as a symbol, until the time came for Solomon, son of David, to build the temple of the Lord. It was raised in Jerusalem with stones of incalculable value, wood brought from Lebanon, and gold skillfully shaped. But among all the details of the divine project, two elements stood at the entrance to the holy place, two massive columns made of cast bronze placed before the main atrium, columns that did not support the roof. They supported memory. The first was named Jachin, the second Boaz. It was not by chance, not for aesthetics, it was testimony. Boaz, the man who upheld a household in times of famine, the judge who did not yield to escape, who preserved justice and honor even when the rest of the nation walked crooked paths. The one who redeemed not just a woman, but a promise. The column on the right side of the temple bore his name. In the tradition of the sages, this was not mere homage, it was affirmation, just as the columns upheld the entrance to the sacred place. Boaz had upheld, through his deeds, the entrance to the messianic lineage. He was strong, like bronze, discreet yet unshakable, invisible to the hurried eye but essential to the structure. When the priests entered the temple and passed between those columns, they knew they were between strength and foundation. Between Yokin, he will establish, and Boaz, in him is strength. It was as if the temple itself reminded them every day that its holiness was not supported only by stones, but by names. And among those names, Boaz remained, silent, eternal. No record tells us that Solomon explained his choice, but the people understood, because Boaz was not remembered only as Ruth's husband or Jesse's grandfather. He was remembered as the man who did what was right when no one else did, who saw where others ignored, who covered with justice when others used the law to expose. Ruth had already passed, Obed too, but the column remained, and with it, the memory of the righteous. In the centuries that followed, even with the temple destroyed and rebuilt, even through exile, the name Boaz never disappeared. Because it was not just a genealogical name, it was a principle. And every time the story of the Moabite and the Redeemer was told, the column of the temple invisibly rose among the listeners, reminding them that what is done with faithfulness endures. And so, even after death, even without a marble monument, Boaz remained, not in statues, but as a foundation, as a pillar, as part of the sacred structure upon which God would write the name of the Messiah. Time did not erase Ruth's origin. Moabite, the name remained beside hers, engraved in scripture, repeated in synagogues, whispered in every genealogy. Ruth, the Moabite, as if the land she came from were a mark, an eternal reminder that the promise is not afraid to walk through impure territories. But for Boaz, that had never been an obstacle. It had been an invitation. The people for generations avoided Moab, and there were reasons: betrayals, curses, women who had seduced Israelite men in Shittim. Moab represented the veiled threat, the contamination of the lineage, the breaking of the covenant, blood that came with shadows. And yet Ruth came from there, not as a trap, but as a redeemed seed. The Talmud, centuries later, would record that many criticized Boaz for taking her as his wife. Some whispered that the law forbade Moabites from entering the congregation of Israel. But the sages reminded them the prohibition applied to men, not women. And Boaz, a deep knower of the Torah, knew this. And so he acted with courage, not in rebellion, but in truth. It was necessary to see beyond the border, beyond prejudice, beyond the shell of misunderstood traditions. It was necessary to have eyes trained not by the letter, but by the spirit of the law. Boaz did not choose Ruth out of convenience, nor out of desire, but out of faithfulness to justice. She who had left her land, her family, her gods, and bowed before a people who did not want her. She who carried in her eyes the strength of women who wait and the grace of those who trust. In Bethlehem, the comments ceased with the birth of Obed. But the memory of her origin was never hidden, and that was a blessing. The royal lineage would be marked by foreigners: Tamar, a Canaanite; Rahab from Jericho; Ruth from Moab. As if God, in his sovereignty, insisted on teaching that there is no pure lineage without redemption, that the promise is fulfilled through paths religion alone does not foresee, that holiness does not choose only the ones born within, but also those who enter by faith. Naomi knew, Ruth even more, and Boaz was the bridge between exclusion and acceptance. Decades later, scribes would try to soften the genealogy. Some would say Ruth was not truly a Moabite, but from a nearby region. Others that the union was symbolic, legal, purely formal. But the sages, those who read with eyes washed by the Spirit, said the opposite. Great is the merit of Boaz, who was not ruled by human judgment, but acted according to truth. Sota 47a. And so, Moab, that land which once symbolized shame, was grafted into the story of glory, not by conquest but by welcome. In Ruth's house, now older, visitors came from afar. Some wanted to hear about the wedding, others about the harvest. But the wisest wanted to understand just one thing. How is it possible that a foreign woman entered the king's lineage? And Ruth, with her calm voice and deep eyes, replied, "Because the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings I came to take refuge, did not see me as a Moabite, but as a daughter. And if he called me that, who am I to forget where I came from?" Matthew 1:5. The lineage of the Messiah does not begin in glory. It begins in silence. It begins in scandals. It begins in stories many would rather forget. Judah, the patriarch, fathered Perez, but did so with Tamar, his daughter-in-law, disguised as a prostitute. Rahab from Jericho was a real prostitute who hid spies and saved her family through faith. Ruth was a Moabite, a foreigner, a widow, an unlikely one. And Boaz was the thread that wove all these voices into a lineage that to human eyes was stained, but to God's eyes was redemptive. When Matthew wrote his genealogy, he did not omit names. On the contrary, he exposed them. And in doing so, he revealed the thread of grace that stitches entire generations together. He wrote, "Salmon begot Boaz by Rahab. Boaz begot Obed by Ruth." He didn't just inform, he proclaimed. There were two women who, in any other tradition, would be hidden. But there, they were given a place of honor. Boaz was not just Rahab's son, he was the fruit of her faith. He grew up in a home where the memory of the past was painful, but transformed. His mother came from Jericho, not Judah, but she was known for her courage, her conversion, her daring belief in a God she did not yet know. And that blood ran in him. Perhaps that's why he could see Ruth like no one else, because he knew what it was to be born of a woman everyone avoided mentioning. He knew what it was to carry a story pointed at by the religious. He knew what it was to inherit a name that had to be upheld with justice. Boaz's lineage was not linear. It was broken, rebuilt, marked by scandal and wounds. But it was exactly there that God chose to plant the promise. Because true hope is not born in perfect stories. It is born where there is pain, loss, repentance, return. Tamar was not forgotten, nor Rahab, nor Ruth, nor Boaz. By marrying Ruth, Boaz did not just redeem an inheritance. He reconnected a thread that had run from Judah, a thread stained with blood, sweat, and tears, but held together by something stronger, faithfulness, not to human perfection, but to the human response to divine grace. In Bethlehem, few spoke of it openly, but in homes, in study circles, the names resurfaced, and as time passed, they came to understand there was something sacred in how that lineage had been preserved. Obed grew up hearing these stories. He knew his father was remembered for justice, but also knew where his grandmother came from. And that knowledge did not shame him. It prepared him. Because the royalty that was coming would not be built by human merit, but by divine interventions. In Broken Stories, Naomi once whispered, "Sometimes heaven writes with the hands the world despises." Boaz was that hand. And by fathering Obed, by receiving Ruth, By honoring Elimelech's memory, he did not cleanse the lineage. He embraced it. And in doing so, he showed that the Messiah would not come from a story without pain, but from a story transformed. Centuries later, when the name of Jesus would be proclaimed, many would be scandalized by the names on the list. But those who knew Boaz, those who knew Ruth, Rahab, Tamar, they would understand. There is no pain the promise cannot redeem, because there are lineages of power, and there are lineages of pain, and it is in the latter that hope is born. Boaz did not cry out in the squares. He did not prophesy on the mountains. He did not lead wars. His name was not engraved in heroic songs or exalted in battle hymns. But among generations, his silence built something more lasting than sound. He lived among the fields and the causes of the humble. He acted with precision, not haste. He spoke little, but with weight. And above all, he acted. What many preached, Boaz fulfilled. What many proclaimed, he practiced, with lowered eyes, firm hands, and a heart in covenant. The Midrash, Ruth Rabbah 8:1, declares that the world is sustained by those who act in silence. Boaz was one of them, a hidden pillar, an unadorned foundation, whose strength did not come from public recognition, but from faithfulness in the unseen. Ruth saw this. Before she was a wife, before she was a mother, she saw it. It was that silence that captivated her, a man who made no promises, but fulfilled purposes, who did not seek others' admiration, but the favor of God, who did not shout for justice, but delivered it daily in shared bread, in space left for the poor, in a gaze that did not judge. Obed, still a child, learned through gestures. He did not remember his father's voice clearly, but he remembered how he walked through the fields, how he paused when seeing someone hungry, how he passed his hand over the grain as if in prayer. And even after death, it was as if Boaz was still nearby, in the servants' faces, in Naomi's eyes, in Ruth's strength. The scribes will say that Boaz begot Obed, and that will be enough. A line, a name, a point in the genealogy. But heaven sees more than the page. Heaven knows what it cost to uphold that name, what had to be relinquished, endured, sustained. Among Israel's judges, few left a legacy that wasn't erased by the dust of centuries. Many shouted but were forgotten. Boaz whispered and remained. His silence became structure, his gesture became path, his legacy became compass. Ruth, with silver now in her hair, once told a younger woman in the village, "Men who shout last a generation. Those who act in silence last 1,000. She didn't speak out of bitterness. She spoke from experience. Boaz never promised to make her forget Moab, never said the people would accept her, never offered guarantees. But day by day, he acted, and that was enough. Today, in every lineage that carries his name, in every psalm sung by his descendant, David, in every act of justice that echoes from his blood, Boaz's silence still speaks, a silence that is not empty, but full of surrender, of obedience, of steadfastness. And that is why he didn't need to impose himself, because his life imposed itself. Because the righteous do not need to raise their voice when the weight of their steps already echoes upon the earth. And so he left behind heirs, not just of blood, but of posture, heirs of silence, of those who prefer to act rather than announce, who prefer to remain rather than display. Boaz did not want to be remembered, and for that reason he will never be forgotten. Did you know that just by subscribing and leaving a like, you're already helping this story reach thousands of other people? That's right, and the best part, it's quick, free, and you become part of this mission. Let's go together to the end. Stay with us, Ruth 2:23. The season returned as if it had never left. The scent of ripe barley filled the fields of Bethlehem, and the wind blew between the sheaves with the same rhythm as years before. But now, something was different, not in the grain, not in the land, but in the names. The fields that once belonged to Boaz were now under the name of Obed. The boy had grown. He was no longer just Ruth's son, Naomi's grandson, the Redeemer's heir. He was now the man who guided the servants, counted the sheaves, marked the boundaries. But something in his stride, a calm step, a watchful gaze, revealed who he had come from. He had not only inherited land, he had inherited gestures. Ruth, seated in the shade of a fig tree, watched. She no longer gleaned, no longer had to fight for scraps, but her eyes still scanned the edges of the field, and from time to time she whispered, "Remember those who still come to glean." Obed did not forget. Like his father, he left room. Like his father, he expected no gratitude. He simply acted, because the field, though his by right, belonged first and foremost to purpose. That year, the ears of grain came in abundance. The baskets filled quickly, the storehouses overflowed, but it was as if, with each handful, the people also harvested memory. Boaz's voice, so rare in life, now echoed in the way Obed distributed the bread, in the way the elders greeted him, in the respectful silence that surrounded him as he passed among the workers. The women of the village, seeing the Moabite's son now grown, smiled among themselves. They no longer spoke of scandal, of origin, or of borders. Now they said, "Who would have thought that from sorrow came wheat?" Naomi, older now, walked slowly, but she still went to the field. She touched the soil with her fingers. Sometimes she closed her eyes and said, "He's still here." She was referring to Boaz, not as a ghost, but as a root. The man who had redeemed the inheritance was now an inseparable part of the land. One morning, Obed harvested a taller, more golden ear of grain. He showed it to Ruth. She smiled, then kept it, not as a trophy but as a symbol, because in that grain she saw the full cycle, the bread of hunger, the hand that protected, the womb that bore, the name that remained. The boys ran between the rows, one of them with brown hair, and curious eyes followed Obed everywhere. It was Jesse, still small, still unaware of what he carried, but the land already recognized him. The servant said, "That one has the steps of a king." Ruth listened and said nothing. She knew promises need not be rushed. She knew the right. Harvest comes in its appointed time, and so the field became a witness of tears, of covenant, of justice, of the womb, of death, and of continuation. Because Boaz's story was not in tombstones, it was in the hands that harvested, in the faces that gave thanks, in the silence that surrounded mealtime, as if everyone knew there was something sacred among them, even if no one spoke it. The barley was harvested, the wheat too, the grain stored, the bread baked, and the promise alive. Samuel 16:1. Time, like rivers, asks no permission. It flows, it washes, it carries, and it shapes. Centuries had passed since Boaz harvested his last ear of grain, since the exchanged sandal sealed a covenant and a lineage, since the promise began to grow in silence. Now, Bethlehem was just another village in Judah, small, forgotten. Nothing in it caught the kingdom's eye. No army was trained there, no school of prophets, no throne. But there, among stones and fig trees, a house remained, the house of Jesse, son of Obed, grandson of Boaz. Jesse was a man with many sons. The youngest, the smallest, tended sheep. His name was David, and in his eyes burned a flame he did not yet know how to name. When his brothers spoke of battles, he spoke of psalms. When his father called, he came quickly. But when nature called, he stayed. Alone, with his harp among hills, writing about a God he saw in branches and thunder. It was to him that the prophet Samuel was sent. Saul had been rejected. Israel needed a king after God's own heart. And God, with the voice that never errs, said to the prophet, "Fill your horn with oil and go. I am sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem, for I have chosen a king for myself from among his sons." Samuel arrived. The sons were presented, the strongest, the tallest, the most experienced, but God rejected each one, until finally the youngest was called, the shepherd, the singer, the forgotten one. And there, before human eyes, Boaz's inheritance manifested, not in power, but in faithfulness, not in a shout, but in anointing. David was anointed with oil, and the Spirit of the Lord came upon him from that day forward. Yet no one there spoke Boaz's name. No psalm was written in his memory, no direct mention. He who had begun the lineage remained in the background. And that was right, because the man who did not seek glory was never erased. He was foundation. David's throne, which would reign for generations, was built upon a heritage of justice, harvest, honor, and obedience. Every royal decision would have, in its roots, the faithfulness of a quiet judge, of a redeemer who never had to ascend an altar to be eternally linked to the kingdom. Ruth did not live to see her great-grandson. Naomi was already dust, but the promise had not died. It moved in the chords of the harp, in the boy's footsteps, in the oil that flowed upon the head of a shepherd destined for royalty. And so Boaz remained, not as a remembered figure, but as fertile soil, as a faithful seed, as the invisible column upon which God raised a house, the house of David, and from that house another king would come. But that was still silence. After David came silence, not a silence of absence, but of waiting, of gestation. The kingdom, once a promise, became fragmented. Kings came and went, altars were raised and torn down, the temple was defiled, rebuilt, and defiled again. The people were exiled, returned and lost themselves once more. The prophets ceased, the songs grew softer, the voice of God for a time fell silent. But the names remained. Among the scrolls kept by scribes, among the stones of rabbinic genealogies, among the memories whispered by mothers to their children by the lamplight, there the names lived, not as pride, but as hope. And among them, somewhere between Perez and David, between Jesse and Obed, Boaz remained. In Luke 3:32, the evangelist traces Jesus' lineage back to Adam. Among so many names, most forgotten, he writes, son of Boaz, son of Salmon. No explanation, no embellishment, just that. But there, in that hidden place, is a root that did not dry up. Because centuries may erase voices, but they do not erase faithfulness. Boaz did not see the Messiah. He did not witness the manger. He knew nothing of the Magi or the stars or the angels. His name was sown in silence, but it sprouted in redemption. Between David and Jesus, the lineage seems broken. The generations become obscure. Some kings were unfaithful, others forgotten. There were betrayals, captivity, idolatry, indifference. But there was something invisible, like a golden thread woven within the fabric, a thread that connected the promises of the past to their future fulfillment, and that thread was not sustained by kings. It was sustained by the righteous. Boaz's name was not exalted in psalms, nor mentioned in prophecies, but he was there as the foundation of a house no one could tear down, the house where justice entered by choice, where compassion was not poetry, it was shared bread. Centuries later, when the evangelists pored over the scrolls of genealogies, they could have simplified, they could have skipped names, but they didn't, because God, who chooses the unlikely, also honors the forgotten. And so, amid the silence of the lineage among so many who failed or disappeared, the name of Boaz remains firm, not as an echo of ancient glory, but as a root that still nourishes. Because inheritance is not only what one leaves behind, it's what holds fast, even when all seems lost. Boaz upheld a name, embraced a foreigner, redeemed a promise, and without knowing it, planted the shadow under which the Savior would be born. In Nazareth, no one spoke his name. But when Jesus read the scroll of Isaiah in the synagogue and said, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing," something in heaven remembered that it had all begun long ago. In the fields of Bethlehem, with a Moabite woman, with a righteous man, with silence. And that is why among genealogies and waiting, among exiles and returns, among failures and promises, the name of Boaz did not disappear. He remained, hidden root, firm, waiting. The hidden seed, Isaiah 11:1. Boaz never heard trumpets. No vision stole words from his mouth. No battle brought him fame. He didn't found cities. He didn't write psalms. He didn't see the sea part. But he was the soil. While others wielded swords and declared judgments, he held grain and sealed covenants. While kings failed and judges faltered, he remained. In silence, with steadfastness, with honor. Boaz was not a prophet, nor a warrior. He was a root, the kind no one sees but that sustains everything, the kind that buries deep into the earth, breaks stones in secret, draws life from the invisible. He was fertile ground where God planted, something that would only bloom centuries later, when the world had already forgotten his name. Isaiah wrote, "A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. From his roots a branch will bear fruit." But Jesse existed only because Boaz believed, because in front of the Moabite widow, he did not see scandal. He saw promise. Because in front of the law, he did not see rigidity. He saw justice with mercy. Because when faced with responsibility, he did not retreat. He covered. The messianic lineage did not begin in glory. It began in hunger, in mourning, in a silent choice among dry fields. It began with a man who chose to remain while others fled. Boaz's greatness was not in what he did, but in how he did it. He did not seek his name among kings, but today his name lies at the beginning of the royal house. He did not build temples, but his name was engraved on a column of the temple. He did not dream of thrones, but he was the foundation of the eternal throne. David would come, Solomon too, and after them, dust, exile, silence. Until one day, in a small village, another woman, also unlikely, would carry in her womb what she did not fully understand, not gathering barley, but carrying life, and that life would bear the blood of Ruth, of Obed, of Jesse, of Boaz. The child would be born among animals, outside the city, without honors, without a crown. But he would carry within himself the fullness of what began when a man took off his sandal, not out of fear, but out of covenant. The Messiah did not sprout from palaces. He sprouted from faithfulness buried in time, from choices made in the dark, from acts no one celebrated, but which heaven recorded. Boaz never knew what would come, never saw the full fruit of his seed, but he trusted, loved with justice, waited with humility, lived with firmness, died with peace, and in this way, by being invisible, he became eternal, because there are men who shine, and there are men who sustain the light of others. Boaz sustained, and for that reason from the dry root life was born.